The price of precision. The train wheels screeched against frozen rails as Edmund Heckler stepped onto the platform at Oberndorf, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter German winter of 1958. The small Württemberg town bore the scars of reconstruction. New concrete buildings standing awkwardly beside medieval timber frames, like old wounds healing with foreign skin. In his leather satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay blueprints that would soon reshape how NATO fought its wars, though he couldn't know it yet. The walk to the Heckler & Koch facility took 15 minutes through streets where American jeeps shared space with horse-drawn carts. Cold War tensions hung in the air like the industrial smoke that drifted from rebuilt factories. Western armies desperately needed reliable weapons, but what they didn't know was that their salvation would emerge from the minds of former enemies, carrying secrets that would haunt its creators for decades. Inside the sterile corridors of the factory, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on workbenches where precision machinery hummed with mechanical devotion. Edmund had inherited this obsession with accuracy from his father, a machinist who crafted components with religious intensity. The Great War had taken Edmund's older brother, leaving him with a complex relationship to weapons, understanding their necessity while mourning their consequences. At 52, Edmund's hands still bore the permanent stains of machine oil. He'd never intended to become an arms designer. After partnering with Theodor Koch and Alex Seidel in 1949 to form Heckler & Koch, they'd initially produced sewing machines and precision machinery. But fate intervened when Spanish ammunition manufacturer Sietme approached them with revolutionary blueprints. A rifle design originally conceived by German engineers led by Ludwig Vorgrimler, who had worked on the experimental STG-45M during the war's final months. The prototype G3 rifle lay disassembled on Edmund's workbench, steel components catching the harsh light like fragments of an unfinished promise. Military experts had dismissed the design as too unconventional, too risky, too German. They couldn't see past their prejudices to recognize the manufacturing genius hidden in the roller-delayed blowback system. "We're chasing ghosts, Edmund," Theodor Koch said, entering the workshop with a cup of bitter coffee. "The Americans have their M14. Why would they need another rifle?" Edmund lifted the bolt assembly, feeling its weight. The delayed blowback system eliminated the need for a gas system, reducing weight and maintenance requirements. More importantly, it could be produced using stamped steel components, revolutionary for military rifle manufacturing. Because their M14 is expensive and difficult to manufacture in wartime quantities, Edmund replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood production costs. European allies struggle with outdated weapons. NATO needs standardization. Through the workshop window, snow fell on the town where American advisors worked alongside German engineers, creating an uneasy partnership born of necessity rather than trust. The strategic crisis was undeniable. NATO forces faced a sobering reality. Their current small arms were inadequate against Warsaw Pact equipment. Military planners spoke in hushed tones about production bottlenecks, interoperability nightmares, and the terrifying prospect of fighting the next war with yesterday's weapons. The alliance needed a rifle that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and effectively across multiple nations, a standardized workhorse that could serve from Arctic Norwegian fjords to Mediterranean coastlines. But translating the set-me concept into reality would demand everything Edmund had learned about precision engineering and mass production. Each component required tolerances that seemed impossible to achieve economically. Where others saw complexity, Edmund recognized manufacturing opportunity. In the facility's small cafeteria, workers shared simple meals of bread, sausage, and hot soup. The smell of industrial lubricants mixed with cooking food, a combination that would forever remind Edmund of this moment when his life's work began to reshape military doctrine. He didn't yet know that his pursuit of manufacturing excellence would produce a weapon system so successful it would outlive the Cold War tensions that inspired it. The development process would become an obsession consuming years of his life. Military trials would repeatedly reveal problems, extraction failures, feeding issues, accuracy inconsistencies. Each setback would push him deeper into technical isolation as development costs mounted and skepticism grew. But Edmund Heckler had learned patience from his machinist father, precision from German industrial tradition, and determination from surviving 2 wars. As he reassembled the prototype rifle that winter evening in 1958, he couldn't imagine that his engineering signature would soon spread across continents, serving armies whose causes he couldn't predict. The man who simply wanted to solve an engineering problem was about to become responsible for one of history's most influential weapons systems. In the sterile corridors of his workshop, surrounded by the familiar sounds of precision manufacturing, Edmund Heckler stared at blueprints that would reshape NATO's entire military doctrine. If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How long can a man carry the weight of unintended consequences? The breakthrough came not through mechanical complexity, but through manufacturing innovation. By early 1959, Edmund had developed production techniques that combined traditional German engineering with modern industrial processes. The receiver was formed from stamped steel with remarkable precision, while the bolt head and delayed roller system were manufactured to specifications that balanced mechanical reliability with mass production requirements. In a small test facility outside Oberndorf, the first successful field trials took place during the harsh winter months. The G3 prototype demonstrated exceptional reliability under adverse conditions: mud, sand, extreme temperatures, and prolonged use. Its 7.62 Kask 51mm NATO cartridge provided excellent range and stopping power. Most importantly, the manufacturing costs were dramatically lower than competing designs. "Look at these numbers," Edmund told his partners, spreading test results across the workshop table. Production cost per unit, 40% less than the M14. Time to manufacture, 60% faster. Failure rate in adverse conditions, negligible. Alex Seidel examined the reports with growing excitement. If these numbers are accurate, every NATO army will want this rifle. But Edmund felt a growing unease as military officials began visiting the facility. Men in uniform studied his blueprints with an intensity that reminded him of his father's warnings about weapons falling into the wrong hands. Each successful test brought them closer to mass production and closer to a reality Edmund wasn't prepared for. The Bundeswehr's adoption of the G3 in late 1959 marked Germany's controversial return to military production, barely 14 years after the war's end. Local newspapers in Württemberg reported the news with mixed emotions. Pride in German engineering capability shadowed by memories of destruction. Edmund's childhood had been shaped by watching his father craft intricate mechanical components with almost religious devotion to accuracy. Young Edmund had absorbed these lessons unconsciously, developing an intuitive understanding of how metal flowed, how tolerances affected performance, how small improvements could yield enormous results. Now those childhood lessons were being translated into military hardware. His older brother Klaus had enlisted enthusiastically in 1914, writing letters home about duty and honor. The last letter arrived 3 months after Klaus died at Verdun, creating a silence in the Heckler household that never fully healed. Edmund had learned to see weapons as both necessary tools and instruments of profound loss. In the factory cafeteria, conversations increasingly focused on politics rather than precision engineering. American advisors spoke about NATO standardization and interoperability. German workers debated the ethics of arms production while acknowledging the economic necessity. The smell of coffee and simple meals created an atmosphere of ordinary humanity pursuing extraordinary technological achievement. "Do you ever think about where these rifles will end up?" asked Maria Schneider, one of the few women working in the facility's administrative offices. Edmund paused over his lunch of bread and soup. "I think about manufacturing quality and production efficiency. Someone else decides deployment." But that answer felt increasingly inadequate as license negotiations began with nations around the world. Norway expressed interest for Arctic operations. Portugal wanted production facilities for their colonial forces. Mexico sought technology transfer agreements. Pakistan required rifles suited to extreme heat and humidity. The weapon that military experts had dismissed as too unconventional was becoming NATO's most sought-after standardized firearm. Yet success carried unexpected burdens Edmund hadn't anticipated when he first examined those Spanish blueprints. Late at night in his workshop, surrounded by the familiar sounds of precision machinery, Edmund often wondered about the path that had led him here. He'd wanted to solve an engineering problem, create a reliable, cost-effective rifle using innovative manufacturing techniques. The roller-delayed blowback system represented pure mechanical elegance, a solution that eliminated unnecessary complexity while improving performance. But mechanical elegance in isolation was different from mechanical elegance in the hands of soldiers. Each successful field test brought them closer to a reality where his engineering decisions would shape military doctrine across multiple continents. The licensing system he developed created an international network of production that would strengthen NATO interoperability while generating crucial revenue for European reconstruction. More subtly, the rifle's success would validate the principle that superior engineering and manufacturing innovation could overcome resource disadvantages, a lesson that would influence military procurement for generations. In the small town of Oberndorf, where medieval traditions mixed uneasily with Cold War technology, Edmund Heckler worked 16-hour days perfecting production techniques for a weapon that would soon reshape how armies fought. His pursuit of manufacturing excellence was about to produce something far more consequential than he had ever imagined. The man who had grown up with grease under his fingernails and the sound of precision manufacturing in his ears was creating a legacy that would outlive the tensions that had inspired it. In workshops across the globe, his roller-delayed blowback system would soon bear his engineering signature, serving causes he couldn't predict in conflicts he couldn't imagine. How does an engineer reconcile innovation with consequences beyond his control? By 1960, the transformation was both swift and profound. Nations across the globe were either purchasing G3 rifles or establishing licensed production facilities. The weapon that had been dismissed as too unconventional became NATO's most successful standardized firearm, with production lines stretching from Norway's fjords to Pakistan's mountains. Letters arrived weekly at the Heckler & Koch facility from military procurement offices, weapons manufacturers, and foreign governments. Each letter represented thousands of rifles, millions of rounds, countless soldiers who would carry Edmund's mechanical innovation into unknown conflicts. In the workshop where it had all begun, Edmund studied a world map now dotted with red pins marking G3 production facilities. Norway for Arctic operations, Portugal for global deployments, Mexico for regional security, Pakistan for border defense. Each pin represented a decision made in distant capitals about how his engineering would serve political objectives he had no part in shaping. 7 different countries now, Theodore Koch observed, joining Edmund at the map. With more inquiries arriving every week, Edmund's response was quieter than usual. "I designed a manufacturing process. I didn't design a foreign policy." But the distinction felt increasingly artificial as reports filtered back from field deployments. The G3's reliability under adverse conditions was proving exceptional, exactly as Edmund had calculated. Mud, sand, extreme temperatures, prolonged use. The rifle performed consistently across environments and situations that pushed equipment to its limits. The success, however, came with complications Edmund hadn't anticipated during those long nights in 1958, when he'd first studied the Spanish blueprints. Military newspapers featured photographs of soldiers carrying rifles bearing his engineering signature. Defense industry publications analyzed the G3's impact on NATO standardization and battlefield effectiveness. More troubling were reports from regions where older conflicts continued to simmer. Portuguese forces in Africa, Mexican border patrols, Pakistani frontier operations. The rifle appeared in contexts Edmund had never imagined, serving causes about which he knew little and understood less. In a letter from his cousin Heinrich, now serving as a technical advisor to NATO procurement offices, Edmund learned details that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The Americans are impressed with production efficiency and cost control. British ordnance specialists praise the reliability statistics. French military planners appreciate the licensing flexibility. Your rifle is solving problems you never knew existed. The engineering problems had indeed been solved. The roller-delayed blowback system eliminated gas system complexity while maintaining reliability. Stamped steel construction reduced manufacturing costs without compromising durability. Production techniques allowed rapid scaling across multiple nations with varying industrial capabilities. But Edmund was beginning to understand that solving engineering problems created human problems of different complexity. In the facility's cafeteria, conversations now included discussions about international politics, colonial conflicts, and Cold War tensions. Workers who had once focused purely on precision manufacturing were learning about geopolitical consequences of their technical expertise. Maria Schneider, now promoted to international contracts coordination, often shared updates that mixed professional pride with personal unease. The production numbers are remarkable, Edmund. Over 100,000 units in the first year, with projections for 500,000 by 1965. The licensing revenue is rebuilding half of Württemberg's industrial base. Economic benefits for the region were undeniable. Oberndorf's unemployment had dropped to near zero. Local suppliers were expanding to meet component demands. Young engineers were choosing to remain in Germany rather than emigrate to America for opportunities. Yet Edmund found himself remembering his father's warnings about precision without wisdom, technique without conscience. The older Heckler had crafted components for civilian machinery, understanding exactly how his work would be used. Edmund's precision served purposes he couldn't predict or control. Late at night in his workshop, examining the latest production samples, Edmund often thought about Klaus, his brother, who had died at Verdun, carrying weapons designed by men who had probably never intended to facilitate mass destruction. The parallel was uncomfortable, but undeniable. The G3 rifle was democratizing advanced military technology, allowing smaller nations to field weapons that matched superpower standards. The licensing system Edmund had developed was creating international networks of production that strengthened alliances while generating revenue for European reconstruction. But democratization of technology wasn't always democratization of wisdom about its use. Each successful licensing agreement represented thousands of rifles that would serve political objectives Edmund had no role in shaping, in conflicts he might never understand, carried by soldiers whose causes he couldn't evaluate. In the winter of 1960, as snow fell again on Oberndorf's medieval streets, now bustling with international weapons industry activity, Edmund Heckler faced a realization that had been building since those first successful field trials. His pursuit of manufacturing excellence had created something that transcended his intentions, his control, and his understanding. The man who had simply wanted to solve an engineering problem was now responsible for one of history's most influential weapons systems. In workshops across 5 continents, his roller-delayed blowback design was shaping military doctrine for nations whose languages he didn't speak, whose histories he barely knew, whose conflicts he couldn't judge. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What burden does an engineer carry when precision becomes policy? In the spring of 1961, a letter arrived that would haunt Edmund Hecla for decades. Written by Captain James Morrison of the British Royal Engineers, it described the G3's performance during a training exercise in Kenya's northern frontier district. Morrison wrote with technical precision about reliability statistics, maintenance requirements, and operational effectiveness under tropical conditions. But buried in the technical language was a human reality Edmund had not fully considered. The rifle's accuracy and reliability have significantly altered tactical doctrine for long-range patrol operations. Local conflicts that might have remained limited are now being resolved with precision and finality that reflect the weapon's capabilities rather than the political complexity of the situation. Edmund read the letter 3 times in his workshop office, windows open to the Württemberg countryside, where spring flowers bloomed between rebuilt factories. Morrison wasn't criticizing the G3's performance, quite the opposite. He was documenting how superior engineering was changing the nature of conflict itself. Similar reports arrived from other deployment locations. Norwegian forces praised the rifle's cold-weather reliability during Arctic exercises. Portuguese officers described its effectiveness in anti-insurgency operations across African territories. Pakistani commanders detailed its performance along disputed border regions where precision often determined outcomes. The technical success was undeniable. Edmund's manufacturing innovations had created a weapon system that performed consistently across environments, climates, and tactical situations that pushed equipment to its limits. The roller-delayed blowback design eliminated problems that had plagued military rifles for decades. But technical success was creating moral complexity Edmund hadn't anticipated when he'd first studied those Spanish blueprints in 1958. Each performance report represented soldiers carrying his engineering decisions into situations where precision translated directly into consequences for human lives. Theodore Koch found Edmund in the workshop one evening, staring at technical drawings spread across his workbench. The same blueprints that had once represented pure engineering challenges now felt weighted with implications neither man had fully understood when they'd begun this work. The Americans want to license production for South Vietnamese forces, Theodore said quietly. The initial order is for 50,000 units. Edmund's response came slowly. Vietnam is becoming more complicated than anyone expected. Military procurement doesn't require political judgments from manufacturers, Theodore replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The distinction between technical capability and political application was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Edmund's workshop had created precision machinery for civilian use throughout the 1950s. Sewing machines, textile equipment, manufacturing tools, products whose applications were predictable and benign. But the G3 rifle existed in a different category. Its very effectiveness created possibilities that hadn't existed before. Regional conflicts that might have remained limited were being resolved with precision that reflected engineering capability rather than political wisdom. In the facility's cafeteria, lunch conversations now included discussions about international conflicts where the G3 was making tactical differences. Workers who had once focused purely on manufacturing quality were learning about geopolitical consequences of their technical expertise. Maria Schneider shared updates that mixed professional achievement with personal uncertainty. Production has reached 200,000 units across all licensed facilities. The revenue is supporting reconstruction projects throughout southwestern Germany, but I sometimes wonder what those 200,000 rifles are actually accomplishing. Edmund understood her unease. Each production milestone represented thousands of soldiers carrying his mechanical innovation into conflicts whose justice he couldn't evaluate, whose outcomes he couldn't predict, whose consequences he couldn't control. The licensing system had indeed created international networks of production that strengthened NATO interoperability while generating revenue for European reconstruction. But it had also created a web of technical relationships that transcended political borders and national interests. Late at night in his workshop, examining the latest production samples from facilities across 4 continents, Edmund often thought about the path that had led him here. His father's devotion to precision, his brother's death at Verdun, his own desire to solve engineering problems through innovative manufacturing techniques. The G3's success was validating the principle that superior engineering and manufacturing innovation could overcome resource disadvantages. But that validation was creating consequences Edmund hadn't considered when precision had been merely a technical challenge rather than a geopolitical factor. Reports from deployment locations continued arriving weekly. Arctic conditions, tropical humidity, desert sand, mountain altitudes. The rifle performed consistently across environmental extremes that proved its engineering excellence. But environmental challenges were simpler than political ones. Each successful field deployment represented Edmund's engineering decisions, shaping military doctrine for nations whose histories he barely knew, whose conflicts he couldn't judge, whose soldiers carried his precision into situations where technical capability became political consequence. In the spring of 1961, as flowers bloomed around Oberndorf's rebuilt factories, Edmund Heckler was beginning to understand that engineering excellence in isolation was different from engineering excellence in the hands of armies. His pursuit of manufacturing perfection had created something that transcended his intentions, his control, and his moral framework. The man who had wanted to solve technical problems was discovering that technical solutions created human problems of different complexity. In workshops across continents, his roller-delayed blowback design was becoming part of conflicts he couldn't comprehend, serving causes he couldn't evaluate, carried by soldiers whose stories he would never know. How does a craftsman maintain integrity when his craft serves purposes beyond his understanding? The revelation came in 1962 through a document that was never supposed to reach Edmund's desk. Dr. Andreas Weber, a Red Cross observer who had been monitoring weapons deployment in various conflict zones, sent a confidential report to Heckler and Koch as part of what he called manufacturer accountability documentation. Weber's report detailed the G3's role in 17 different conflicts across 4 continents during 1961-1962. The document was clinically precise, documenting tactical applications, casualty statistics, and operational effectiveness with the same methodical approach Edmund used for engineering specifications. But Weber's conclusions transcended technical analysis. The G3 rifle has fundamentally altered the dynamics of regional conflicts by providing military precision that exceeds the political sophistication of the conflicts in which it is deployed. Superior engineering is being applied to inferior political solutions, creating outcomes that reflect technological capability rather than wisdom. Edmund read the report in his workshop office as winter returned to Oberndorf. Snow fell past windows that now overlooked a town transformed by weapons industry prosperity. The same precision that had built his engineering reputation was being documented as a factor in conflicts whose complexity his manufacturing innovations couldn't solve. The most troubling section of Weber's report dealt with what he termed precision escalation, the tendency for conflicts involving technically superior weapons to resolve through military efficiency rather than political negotiation. The G3's reliability and accuracy were eliminating tactical uncertainties that had previously encouraged diplomatic solutions. Maria Schneider found Edmund in his workshop that evening, staring at technical drawings that had once represented pure engineering challenges but now felt weighted with moral implications he had never anticipated. "The Weber report," she said quietly. "You've read it." Edmund nodded, without looking up from blueprints that suddenly seemed different. The roller-delayed blowback system that had once represented mechanical elegance now felt like a precision instrument being applied to imprecise human problems. "We solved the engineering problem," Edmund said finally. "We created a rifle that works perfectly under any conditions, that can be manufactured efficiently, that provides military advantages to any army that carries it. We solved every technical challenge." "But," Maria prompted. "But technical solutions don't create political wisdom," Edmund replied. "Our precision is being applied to conflicts that require different kinds of understanding." The G3's success had indeed democratized advanced military technology, allowing smaller nations to field weapons that matched superpower standards. The licensing system Edmund had developed had created international networks of production that strengthened alliances while generating revenue for reconstruction. But democratization of technology wasn't democratization of judgment about its use. Each licensed rifle represented his engineering decisions, serving political objectives he had no role in shaping, in conflicts whose justice he couldn't evaluate, whose outcomes he couldn't predict. Reports from deployment locations continued documenting the rifle's exceptional performance. Arctic reliability, tropical durability, desert functionality, mountain effectiveness. The G3 performed consistently across environmental extremes that proved Edmund's engineering excellence. But Weber's analysis revealed a different pattern. The rifle's very reliability was changing how conflicts were resolved. Regional disputes that might have remained limited were being settled through military precision that reflected technological capability rather than political sophistication. In the facility's cafeteria, lunch conversations had evolved from celebration of technical achievements to uncomfortable discussions about global consequences of local engineering decisions. Workers who had once focused purely on manufacturing quality were grappling with geopolitical implications of their expertise. Edmund's father had crafted components for civilian machinery, understanding exactly how his precision would be applied. His brother Klaus had died carrying weapons whose designers probably never intended to facilitate mass destruction. Now, Edmund found himself occupying an uncomfortable position between those two realities. The G3 rifle was proving that superior engineering and manufacturing innovation could indeed overcome resource disadvantages. But that proof was creating consequences that transcended the engineering problems Edmund had originally wanted to solve. Late at night in his workshop, examining production samples from facilities across 5 continents, Edmund often wondered about the soldiers carrying his mechanical innovations into conflicts he couldn't comprehend. Each rifle bore his engineering signature, but served causes he couldn't judge, carried by men whose stories he would never know. Weber's report had documented something Edmund had sensed but hadn't fully acknowledged. His pursuit of manufacturing excellence had created a weapon system so successful that its technical capabilities were becoming political factors in conflicts across the globe. The precision he had achieved was altering the nature of military conflict itself. In the winter of 1962, as snow covered Oberndorf's streets, now bustling with international weapons industry activity, Edmund Heckler faced a realization that challenged every assumption he had maintained about the relationship between engineering excellence and human consequences. The man who had simply wanted to solve a manufacturing problem had become responsible for one of history's most influential weapon systems. His roller-delayed blowback design was shaping military doctrine for nations whose languages he didn't speak, whose histories he barely knew, whose conflicts his technical precision couldn't resolve. The engineering problem had been solved perfectly. The human problem was just beginning. What happens when an engineer realizes his precision has become part of problems he never intended to solve? By 1965, the G3 rifle had achieved production numbers that exceeded Edmund's most optimistic projections. Over 500,000 units manufactured across licensed facilities on 5 continents, with orders extending into the next decade. The weapon that military experts had dismissed as too unconventional had become NATO's most successful standardized firearm. But success had brought Edmund face to face with consequences he could no longer ignore. Reports from deployment locations documented conflicts where the G3's precision was determining outcomes that political negotiations might have resolved differently. Weber's analysis had proven prophetic. Technical excellence was being applied to situations that required political wisdom. The transformation in Edmund himself was subtle but profound. He still arrived at the workshop each morning, still examined production samples with the same attention to detail his father had taught him. But the passion for pure engineering had been tempered by understanding of how precision translated into human consequences. In his workshop office, letters from military procurement offices around the world continued arriving weekly. Each letter represented thousands of rifles, millions of rounds, countless soldiers who would carry his engineering decisions into conflicts he couldn't predict or control. The technical achievement was undeniable, but its implications had grown beyond anything Edmund had anticipated. Theodor Koch found him one winter evening in 1966, sitting quietly among technical drawings that had once represented exciting challenges, but now felt weighted with moral complexity. "The Americans are requesting license expansion for Southeast Asian operations," Theodor said. "The initial order would be our largest yet." Edmund's response came slowly. "Vietnam has become what Weber predicted. Technical precision applied to political problems that require different kinds of solutions. We're engineers, not diplomats," Theodor replied, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried in earlier conversations. The distinction was becoming impossible to maintain. Edmund's engineering had achieved everything he had originally hoped: reliability under adverse conditions, efficient manufacturing, cost-effective production, international standardization. But achieving those goals had created responsibilities he had never anticipated. Maria Schneider, now coordinator of international licensing agreements, shared updates that mixed professional accomplishment with personal unease. The G3 had democratized advanced military technology, allowing developing nations to field weapons that matched superpower standards. The licensing system had created international networks of production that strengthened alliances while generating revenue for European reconstruction. But democratization of technology hadn't brought democratization of wisdom about its application. Each successful licensing agreement represented thousands of rifles serving political objectives Edmund had no role in shaping, in conflicts whose justice he couldn't evaluate, whose outcomes reflected engineering capability rather than political sophistication. The most difficult realization came gradually through accumulated reports from deployment locations. The G3's exceptional performance was changing how regional conflicts were resolved. Superior reliability and accuracy were eliminating tactical uncertainties that had previously encouraged diplomatic solutions. Edmund's precision was becoming a factor in political equations he couldn't influence or understand. Technical excellence was altering the nature of conflict itself, creating outcomes that reflected manufacturing innovation rather than political wisdom. In the spring of 1967, as flowers bloomed around Oberndorf's prosperous streets, Edmund received a final letter from Dr. Weber. The Red Cross observer was retiring from fieldwork, but his concluding assessment was stark. The G3 rifle represents engineering excellence applied to human problems that engineering alone cannot solve. Its success has validated technical innovation while revealing the limitations of technical solutions to political conflicts. Weber's words crystallized something Edmund had been feeling but hadn't articulated. His pursuit of manufacturing excellence had produced a weapon system so successful that it outlived the Cold War tensions that had inspired it. The rifle continued serving in conflicts around the world, its mechanical reliability testament to engineering principles he had mastered decades earlier. He had succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions, yet success felt more complex than he had anticipated when he first examined those Spanish blueprints in 1958. The delayed blowback system that had emerged from his obsession with manufacturing precision was now shaping military doctrine in dozens of nations. Late at night in his workshop, examining the same technical drawings that had launched his career in weapons manufacturing, Edmund often thought about paths not taken. He could have remained focused on civilian machinery, precision equipment whose applications were predictable and benign. But the path he had chosen had led to something unprecedented. A weapon system that democratized military technology while raising questions about the relationship between engineering excellence and human consequences. The G3 rifle had proven that innovative engineering, combined with industrial vision, could reshape military history. In his later years, Edmund Heckler would reflect on the paradox he had created. His pursuit of manufacturing excellence had produced a weapon system so successful that its technical capabilities became political factors in conflicts across the globe. The rifle appeared in situations he had never imagined, serving armies whose causes he couldn't predict. The man who had simply wanted to solve an engineering problem found himself responsible for one of history's most influential weapon systems. But the true legacy lay not in the weapon itself, but in the manufacturing revolution it represented and the questions it raised about precision, responsibility, and the unintended consequences of excellence. The G3 rifle stands today in museums and armories worldwide, its distinctive profile instantly recognizable to military historians and veterans alike. But for Edmund, the lasting memory would always be those winter nights in 1958 when precision seemed like a pure pursuit before he understood that technical solutions could create human problems of different complexity. In the end, it wasn't just a rifle that endured. It was the demonstration that the most profound innovations often emerge from workshops where engineers refuse to accept that something cannot be done, without fully understanding what doing it might mean. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What legacy does a craftsman leave when his craft reshapes the world in ways he never intended?